Hello, welcome to McGuffey's Online Tutor. We're going to continue today with McGuffey's 6th Eclectic Reader, the revised edition, lesson 130, Character of Washington, part 2. In the first lesson in a previous video, we discussed Jared Sparks, who wrote a biography on George Washington, and this lesson 130 is an excerpt of his work. Hopefully you'll go back if you haven't watched part 1 to get the information on Jared Sparks, which is very interesting since he was a Unitarian pastor and president of Harvard. So today let's look at the lesson itself. The person of Washington was commanding, graceful, and fitly proportioned. His stature 6 feet, his chest broad and full, his limbs long and somewhat slender, but well shaped and muscular. His features were regular and symmetrical, his eyes of a light blue color, and his whole countenance in its quiet state was grave, placid, and benignant. When alone or not engaged in conversation, he appeared sedate and thoughtful. But when his attention was excited, his eye kindled quickly and his face beamed with animation and intelligence. Young George Washington. George Washington was born in a plain, old-fashioned house in Westmoreland County, Virginia, on the 22nd day of February, 1732. He was sent to what was called an old field school. The country schoolhouses in Virginia at that time were built in fields too much worn out to grow anything. In those old schoolhouses, children would use hornbooks to learn the alphabet, figures, special scriptures, special prayers. Here's an example of those hornbooks. And they would also learn how to write script. And this is the script that was used in the time of George Washington. And here is a note George Washington wrote to James Madison for an example of his handwriting. When George Washington was a young man, he was employed as a surveyor. A surveyor is an engineer who determines the boundaries and elevations of land or structures. So Thomas, Lord Fairfax, who owned great estates on the Rappahannock River, removed from there in 1745 and settled at Greenway Court, 13 miles from Winchester. The king had given Fairfax a patent of a vast tract of land in the valley, which he employed George Washington to survey. Washington, remember, was born in 1732 at Wakefield, near Bridges Creek on the Potomac River in Westmoreland County, Virginia. His great-grandfather, John Washington, had come from England to Virginia in about 1657. Washington was only 17 years old when he was employed as a surveyor, but he did his work so well that no mistake has ever been found in the many surveys made by him. But George Washington was the person who, both by his work, by his character, by his commanding person, made this country, the United States of America, possible. Without him, it could not have been. He was a very remarkable man. In some respects, he was the most illiterate of all the great figures of that day. As a matter of fact, Washington had had very little education compared to all the other great Americans of the period. He was a son to his father by a second marriage, and his father died when he was quite young. His elder brother inherited the estate, and George Washington was nothing but a poor relative working for his half-brother. As a result, he did not have much education, and although later he gained a substantial estate, to the end of his life he was very self-conscious of the fact that he could not spell very well and was not always sure of his grammar. For this reason, too, towards the end of his life, he began to go through all the letters he had written, because he kept copies of all the letters he wrote both as an individual and as an officer and as president. And he rewrote them with two things in mind: to correct the grammatical errors and misspellings he had made when he was writing hurriedly, and second, to eliminate anything he thought might be hurtful needlessly to any person. Now this was quite a job when you realize that he wrote 75,000 letters. He was not fluent in speech, but what he said was apposite, and listened to with the more interest as being known to come from the heart. He seldom attempted sallies of wit or humor, but no man received more pleasure from an exhibition of them by others, and although contented in seclusion, he sought his chief happiness in society, and participated with delight in all its rational and innocent amusements. Without austerity on the one hand, or an appearance of condescending familiarity on the other, he was affable, courteous, and cheerful. But it has often been remarked that there was a dignity in his person and manner not easy to be defined, which impressed everyone that saw him for the first time with an instinctive deference and awe. This may have risen in part from a conviction of his superiority, as well as from the effect produced by his external form and deportment. George Washington's beloved Mount Vernon began as a 1.5-story farmhouse built in around 1735, that date can be argued, by his father Augustine, and received its well-known name during the ownership of his half-brother Lawrence. George acquired Mount Vernon in 1754, and over the next 45 years slowly enlarged the dwelling to create the resplendent 21-room residence we see today. Washington personally supervised each renovation, advising on design, construction, and decoration, even during the Revolutionary War, or the War of Independence. Here are a few slides to show you the progression of the house with the different dates. I find them quite interesting. The character of his mind was unfolded in the public and private acts of his life, and the proofs of his greatness are seen almost as much in the one as the other. The same qualities which raised him to the ascendency he possessed over the will of a nation, as the commander of armies and chief magistrate, caused him to be loved and respected as an individual. Wisdom, judgment, prudence, and firmness were his predominant traits. No man ever saw more clearly the relative importance of things and actions, or divested himself more entirely of the bias of personal interest, partiality, and prejudice, and discriminating between the true and the false, the right and the wrong, in all questions and subjects that were presented to him. He deliberated slowly, but decided surely, and when his decision was once formed, he seldom reversed it, and never relaxed from the execution of a measure till it was completed. Courage, physical and moral, was a part of his nature, and whether in battle or in the midst of popular excitement, he was fearless of danger and regardless of consequences to himself. Even the French Marquis de Lafayette loved George Washington so much that he named his son for him. George Washington Lafayette. There's also another very interesting story about George Washington during the French and Indian War against the British. At the time, George Washington was only a 23-year-old colonel of the ill-fated war along the banks of the Monongahela River near Fort Duquesne, which is now Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. American colonies were forced to come together for the first time and join with England to fight a common foe, France, and the Indians who had joined with them. Between 1688 and 1763, England and France had been at war with each other in several different places in Europe. Then in 1754, war erupted, here for territorial control of America. George Washington's role in the affair really began in October 31st, 1753, when he was commissioned as ambassador by Governor Robert Dinwiddie of Virginia to carry a diplomatic objection to General St. Pierre stationed at Fort Le Boeuf on the shore of Lake Erie. This was a final precursor to war over the territorial claim of the Ohio Valley between England and France. This was a treacherous journey of more than 500 miles over rough terrain, dense forest, and through flooded river valleys. He had to take an interpreter with him and a small party. There was no guarantee that they would receive a warm welcome. Can you imagine a 21-year-old? Can you imagine a 21-year-old right now in our time representing us as ambassador to, say, Iran? But God was grooming George Washington to become the great leader that he was. The French did not back down on their claim to the Ohio Valley, so in 1754, George Washington began to help raise troops in Virginia. He was made lieutenant colonel and given a command. On May 1st, 1754, Washington set out to retake the area of Fort Duquesne. He had come upon it on his emissarial journey and made note of its excellent position the year before. But in the interim, the French had begun to build Fort Duquesne. Washington was informed by 2 Indian scouts of a small scouting party approaching them. Out of necessity, he built a small stockade 60 miles from the French fort and aptly named it Fort Necessity. He then attacked the party, determined to make the first strike. A French leader named Jumonville and 10 of his men were killed, and 21 were made prisoners. After some time went by with scarce reinforcements, Washington barely had 400 troops. Washington decided to advance on the French fort, and on July 3rd, Washington was approached by General de Villers and 1,200 of his men. He fell back to Fort Necessity and was deluged by musket balls from the French and Indians stationed amongst the trees and rocks. The French and Indians remained in full circle around Fort Necessity, pelting them with musket balls for 9 hours. The Americans bravely resisted them, and only 30 of Washington's men were killed. At length, General de Villers offered up terms of surrender to the Americans. Washington accepted the honorable terms, and he and his army were allowed to leave with their equipment and provisions. Later, Washington was given public thanks by the House of Burgesses for a valiant stand against overwhelming odds. Enter General Edward Braddock, one of England's most experienced officers. He had heard of the prowess of George Washington and asked him to become one of his aides, allowing Washington to retain his previous rank. Washington's mother feared for her son's life and tried to persuade him to stay home. Washington replied, "The God, Jesus Christ, to whom you commended me, madam, when I set out upon a more perilous errand, defended me from harm, and I trust he will do so now. Do not you?" The stage was now set. Washington had done everything he could to inform General Braddock of the guerrilla-style tactics of the French and Indians. But Braddock was insulted to be advised by an inferior officer. So he didn't heed Washington's prudent warning. Indians on American side tried to enlist their services as well, and Braddock dismissed them as savages with little or no merit. On the morning of July 9th, 1755, Braddock and 1,000 of his men, along with Washington and some of his Virginia regulars, crossed the southern shore of the Monongahela. Colonel Thomas Gage had a forward detachment of 350 soldiers, 250 workers, and an axeman cutting a path. They were about 10 miles from the French fort. Around 1 p.m., Gage and the forward detachment had just crossed a ravine when the scouts and flanking parties came running back towards them, waving them off. Just then, they were hit with a fusillade of musket balls. It immediately became chaos. The British could not see their enemy because they were hidden behind rocks, hills, and trees. The rain of bullets kept coming in on them, dropping them like flies. Gage's men fired back at the direction of the smoke, plumes from their enemies' rifles, but hit nothing but the rocks, hills, and trees, merely splintering bark. Gage's men and the horses continued to drop. Some of the wounded horses began to panic and bolt, carrying wagons full of their weapons and ammo, trampling men on the ground as they galloped off. The workers and axemen also began to flee in panic. For the Indians, who were crack marksmen, this was like shooting fish in a barrel. Eventually, what was left of Gage's forward detachment began to retreat. General Braddock, hearing the gunfire, left 400 troops along with most of the Virginia regulars with Sir Peter Halket and most of the baggage. Braddock and his remaining troops, Washington and 100 or so Virginia militia, hastened toward the battle. The retreating men collided with the advancing men, setting them to more confusion. All the while, the French and Indians continued to rain down musket balls upon them with deadly accuracy and force. It became an instant slaughter as Braddock instructed his men to form columns, which made them easy to hit because of their red coats and of being in plain sight, like they were accustomed to doing in Europe. Musket balls rained down on them at will, cutting them down like a lawnmower cuts grass and anything else that gets in its way, with an instantaneous efficiency. The 100 or so Virginia men quickly adopted the Indian style of warfare and dropped behind trees and shot only when an enemy target was visible. General Braddock was furious at this and barked orders for them to get out from behind the trees. He saw this as cowardice, according to his rules of engagement. He was undaunted in his task, bravely going to and fro amidst a shower of musket balls, trying to rally his troops. During this time, he had 5 horses shot out from under him. But in spite of his bravery and reckless courage, he could not stem the tide. At the same time, God's hand can be seen protecting George Washington while he was busy going back and forth across the battlefield, completely exposed, carrying out General Braddock's orders. One soldier, observing Washington, stated, "I expected every moment to see him fall. Nothing but the superintending care of Providence could have saved him." Indians later testified that they had singled him out, but their bullets had no effect on him, and they were convinced that an invisible power was protecting him. Washington had 2 horses shot out from under him and 4 bullet holes in his coat, yet he himself was untouched by bullet, bayonet, tomahawk, or arrow. Scores of victims had fallen beside him, yet he went unharmed. He had been protected by God's hand. Every other mounted officer had been slain. George Washington's ambition was of that noble kind which aims to excel in whatever it undertakes, and to acquire a power over the hearts of men by promoting their happiness and winning their affections. Sensitive to the approbation of others, and solicitous to deserve it, he made no concessions to gain their applause. either by flattering their vanity or yielding to their caprices. Cautious without timidity, bold without rashness, cool in counsel, deliberate but firm in action, clear in foresight, patient under reserves, steady, persevering, and self-possessed. He met and conquered every obstacle that obstructed his path to honor, renown, and success. More confident in the uprightness of his intention than in his resources, he sought knowledge and advice from other men. He chose his counselors with unerring sagacity, and his quick perception of the soundness of an opinion and of the strong points in an argument enabled him to draw to his aid the best fruits of their talents and the light of their collected wisdom. Those of you who have studied American history in the not too remote past may remember the Conway Cabal, when a group of officers and citizens, members of Congress, formed a conspiracy to out George Washington, as commander and replace him with General Gates or someone else. Now, for the members of Congress to think along these lines was legitimate, but for army officers to conspire behind their commander's back to have him ousted was not legitimate. One of the worst men in this conspiracy was Dr. Benjamin Rush. Well, one of the letters fell into the hands of Patrick Henry, and Patrick Henry immediately forwarded the letter to Washington and warned him of what was apparently going on. And he left it to Washington to act, but offered to give him any assistance whatsoever. How this was something that could be very serious, how did Washington handle it? Well, he simply wrote a letter to Brigadier General Conway as follows. The 9th of November, 1777. Sir, a letter which I received last night contained the following paragraph. In a letter from General Conway to General Gates, he says, Heaven has been determined to save your country, or a weak general and bad counselors would have ruined it. I am, sir, your humble servant, George Washington. That was all. Well, Conway began to sweat, and every other officer that was in the cabal began to sweat as well, wondering, how much does Washington know? He just said that and nothing more, and went on as though nothing had happened. They'd come around and make an occasion, everyone in the conspiracy, to talk to him, to see what his attitude was like, and how much did he know. And he was just the same as always, but they felt more and more uncomfortable in his eyes. So every one of them came quickly in to confess and to say, well, I didn't mean to, I didn't take it seriously, and so on. And the whole thing disappeared. Now, if Washington had tried to prosecute the matter, they would have immediately said, well, where's your evidence? You don't have enough evidence to convict us. It wouldn't have been a legal matter, you see. But since he did nothing but simply indicate, I know what's going on, they were busy imagining every kind of possible act he was going to take, and they fell apart. And that's the kind of leadership he exercised. But most importantly, he never at any point took it out upon any man that was involved in the cabal. He knew their strengths and he knew their weaknesses. And he used every one of those men, both them and later on as the president, he used some of them, wherever he thought they could do the most good. In other words, his thinking was, It's not how they feel about me as an individual. It is what can they do for the country. Some of them were actually appointed to high office when he became president. George Washington understood people. He knew what they were and what they could do. And as a result, because he was above being personal, he could lead men. Washington believed that God alone could change man. Human advice alone could not. But there was a human answer to man's condition: law and order. And Washington believed strongly in this. And militarily, this meant discipline. Washington sought to set an example for the men. As a Christian gentleman, as a Christian officer, and have strong discipline. He was emphatic at all time of the need for chaplains, about the need of drills, about the need of taking the troops and making them into seasoned soldiers. We have no idea because the books give us a very inadequate picture. What a tremendous problem he had. His ability to impose discipline upon the soldiers was very limited. They were an army of volunteers for the most part, and they deserted readily and easily. As a matter of fact, one historian has written, and I quote, "It is rather breathtaking now, after all the bunk about unanimous resistance that our school history choked down our young throats, to realize that perhaps 40% of the population of the colonies was flamingly pro-British." Let us pause for a moment for figures. The total population of America on the day that Washington took command of the army at Cambridge was approximately 2,500,000. Let us say generously that at least half of the total were women. This leaves 1,250,000 males. In the Revolution, there was no age limit in the army. Men from 16 to 60 fought side by side in the rebel army. Consequently, consider the appalling child mortality which cut down most children before they reached 16. About 5 out of 7 males were within the limits of a draft. That leaves perhaps 892,850 effective. But from this, we must subtract the 40% who were loyalists. 535,700 men remain. Now we must remember the element that was neither loyalist nor patriot. We must remember the lukewarm, the neutral, who trembled between the two extremes, vacantly waiting to see which side would win. When the war was over and America triumphed, these people claimed to have been as patriotic as the rest. But during those 7 so harrowing years, these lukewarmers numbered about 25%, or over 300,000 of the male population. After all these eliminations, about 225,000 men remain as the potential military equivalent that Washington ought to have been able to rely on. As things turned out, he never once had an army over 25,000. And most of the time, straggling and bedazzled, it numbered between 3,000 and 15,000. The 15,000 at Brandywine was the largest force Washington ever took into the field for a single engagement. It is hard to reconcile these cold facts with our pink and white American traditions of the spirit of 1776. Unquote. This was taken from A Short History of the American Revolution by John Hyde Preston. Now Langdons Point was, "We too, if we hearken to the word of God, and if we obey the law of God, shall be blessed by God, with a mighty conquest." And so he begins by saying, "Here Moses recommends to Israel the strict observance of all the laws which he has delivered to them, by God's command, relating both to their civil polity and religion, as the sure way to raise their reputation high above all nations, as a wise and understanding people, because no other nation was blessed with such excellent national laws, or the advantage of applying to the oracle the living God, and praying to him in all difficulties with assurance that all their requests would be answered. He also says on Christian schools, train them up in the fear of God, in an acquaintance with his word, to all such useful knowledge as your abilities will allow, and they will soon know how to provide for themselves, and perhaps may take care of their aged parents, and fill the various stations in life with honor and advantage. We cannot understand this country apart from this kind of preaching. You see, every time they went to church in those days, from 1740 on, this was the kind of preaching they got. As a matter of fact, there is a very famous sermon by Timothy Dwight, I think in 1795. But Timothy Dwight summoned the men of Connecticut and men of New England to educate the young, to conquer in one area after the other, to have as tremendous an influence in every area in the name of the Lord that they possibly could. And it is interesting that that sermon, which was repeated over and over again, reprinted, circulated far and wide, had a profound influence for a few generations. And it was New England men who migrated westward, and their influence in the new country which they settled was tremendous. Now, de Tocqueville in Volume 1 makes this statement: a single fact will suffice to show the prodigious number of individuals who leave New England to settle themselves in the wilds. We are sure that in 1830, that 36 of the members of Congress were born in the little state of Connecticut. Well, that is a remarkable fact, is it not? And Timothy Dwight had a great deal to do with it. And in every area of life, they felt after they read the sermon that Timothy Dwight wrote, which was reprinted over and over again as one of the most extensive publishing histories in America. Well, we've got a duty to conquer in every area, to exercise authority, to rule. And remember that I said earlier that Timothy Dwight wrote a long poem on the conquest of Canaan, in which he saw the colonists as the new Israel of God, and George Washington as the new Joshua. So now in his sermon, he was telling them that God required them to go out and to conquer, or if they stayed where they were, to conquer where they were, and to exercise dominion. George Washington's moral qualities were in perfect harmony with those of his intellect. Duty was the ruling principle of his conduct, and the rare endowments of his understanding were not more constantly tasked to devise the best methods of effecting an object than they were to guard the sanctity of conscience. No instance can be adduced in which he was actuated by a sinister motive or endeavored to attain an end by unworthy means. Truth, integrity, and justice were deeply rooted in his mind, and nothing could rouse his indignation so soon or so utterly destroy his confidence as a discovery of the want of these virtues in anyone whom he had trusted. Weakness, follies, indiscretions he could forgive, but subterfuge and dishonesty he never forgot and rarely pardoned. The country after the Revolution, the long war for independence, had drained the resources and crippled the industries of the whole country. Trade had flourished in the colonies, but the British fleets had destroyed so many American vessels that the commerce of the country seemed almost dead. This decline of trade was especially hard on the seafaring people of New England. In the Middle States, which were chiefly agricultural, there seemed little energy left. In the Southern states, the crops had been destroyed, the cattle eaten, the horses stolen, and thousands of the slaves carried off. These evils were aggravated by the fact that there was no money in the country. The Articles of Confederation gave a very weak government. It was Washington, the commander-in-chief, who took the lead in seeing to it that there was a new Constitution. Now, the weakness of the Articles of Confederation, which started to all to whom, did not provide an executive branch. It did not provide a judiciary branch, and there was no power to tax. There was a lack of quorums, too much power to borrow money and issue paper money. No amendment without 100% vote from every state could be made. So this was the weakness of the Articles of Confederation. Paper money led to enormous problems because during the War of Independence, the Continental, which was the paper money at the time, exploded in inflation. It wasn't worth anything. It was not worth a Continental. That's where that saying comes. And George Washington in the books was paid enormous amount of worthless Continental dollars for his expenses, even though he took no salary as commander-in-chief. The Articles of Confederation gave a very weak government. This is why it was Washington who led the move for a new constitution. Now, some of the radical writers, especially the Marxists, tried to make out that the people fought for the freedom they had. But then a group of reactionaries shoved the Constitution down their throat. And you will get this in most colleges and universities. This is rubbish. It was the men who fought, who also were responsible for the new government of the Constitution of 1787, our Constitution. It was Washington, the commander-in-chief, who took the lead in seeing to it that there was a new Constitution. It was Washington who presided at the Constitutional Convention. And today in our courts of law, the witness's oath means nothing. The most flagrant kinds of lies are routine. The oath of office to uphold the Constitution, again, means nothing. But the oath is important. It is basic to society. In the oath, man promises to live by his word, by the oath he has taken as God keeps his word absolutely. In taking an oath, a man invokes all the judgments of God for violation of that oath. And although men today may have no regard for the oath, God declares he will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. He was candid and sincere, true to his friends and faithful to all, neither practicing dissimulation, descending to artifice, nor holding out expectations which he did not intend should be realized. His passions were strong, and sometimes they broke out with vehemence, but he had the power of checking them in an instant. Perhaps self-control was the most remarkable trait of his character. It was, in part, the effect of discipline. Yet he seems by nature to have possessed this power to a degree which has been denied to other men. George Washington didn't go around talking about abolition. Jefferson did. Jefferson did not free his slaves. Washington did. Washington was not a man to talk, partly because he was self-conscious about his lack of education, but he was the wisest head we had at the time. He and Patrick Henry were the farthest seeing men in the country. But Washington recognized that the country was split unless in some way it was brought together in a strategic manner. And he knew the answer. In his work as a surveyor, he had recognized the vast coal deposits in Virginia, in what is now West Virginia. It was a long time after Washington that the country woke up to that fact. But Washington knew they were there. He had spoken about them, and he felt the logical place to build a capital is right near those coal deposits. The capital should not be a petrified city like Versailles or London with a lot of governmental buildings. It should be an industrial city. It should be the heart of this country as far as manufacturing is concerned. In other words, the capital should be where the action is. And his feeling was, there is no better place for industry to grow than in this locale. You have a magnificent port available. You have the coal deposits nearby. Here, industry can grow, and this can be the world's greatest manufacturing center. This will bind the North and the South. The raw materials of the South can be developed in what is really a part of the South. And if industry grows up here, then free labor will prosper in this area. And the South will see that slavery is not as productive. And slavery will gradually disappear. Now, Washington's vision was tremendous. If the country had followed George Washington at this point, history would have been totally different. There would be no war in 1860 following. There would have been a tremendous industrial development in a way that we have not seen, a far more logical and economic one. May a crown of universal love and gratitude, of universal admiration, and of the universal reverence and honor of thy saved country rest and flourish upon the head of its veteran general and glorious defender, until by the divine Jesus, whom thou hast loved and adored, and of whose holy religion thou art not ashamed, thou shalt be translated from the world of war to a world of peace, liberty, and eternal triumph. Now that's how they felt about him. Yet the irony of the fact is that today there are few Americans who do more than vilify. A Christian in faith and practice, he was habitually devout. His reverence for religion is seen in his example, his public communications, and his private writings. He uniformly ascribed his successes to the beneficent agency of Supreme Being. Charitable and humane, he was liberal to the poor and kind to those in distress. As a husband, son, and brother, he was tender and affectionate, without vanity, ostentation, or pride. He never spoke of himself or his actions unless required by circumstances which concerned the public interests. As he was free from envy, so he had the good fortune to escape the envy of others by standing on an elevation which none could hope to attain. If he had one passion more strong than another, it was love of his country. The purity and ardor of his patriotism were commensurate with the greatness of its object. Love of country in him was invested with the sacred obligation of a duty, and from the faithful discharge of his duty he never swerved for a moment, either in thought or deed, through the whole period of his eventful career. Such are some of the traits of the character of Washington, which have acquired for him the love and veneration of mankind. If they are not marked with the brilliancy, the extravagance, and eccentricity, which in other men have excited the astonishment of the world, so neither are they tarnished by the follies, nor disgraced by the crimes of those men. It is the happy combination of rare talents and qualities, the harmonious union of the intellectual and moral powers, rather than the dazzling splendor of any one trait, which constitute the grandeur of his character. If the title of great man ought to be reserved for him who cannot be charged with an indiscretion or a vice, who spent his life in establishing the independence, the glory, and durable prosperity of his country, who succeeded in all that he undertook, and whose successes were never won at the expense of honor, justice, integrity, or by the sacrifice of a single principle, the title will not be denied to Washington. How sweetly on the ear such echoes sound, while the mere victors may appall or stun. The servile and the vain, such names will be a watchword till the future shall be free. By Byron. Well, that's the end of our lesson 130 of McGuffey's Sixth Eclectic Reader, Character of Washington by Jared Sparks. And I hope that you visit McGuffeysonlinetutor.com for more lessons. Don't forget to like and share. And I really hope that this is just the beginning of your research, your personal interest in the wonderful George Washington, our first president of the United States. First in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. Bye-bye. Peace be with you.